Taliban fighters have opened fire on demonstrators marking Afghanistan's National Day in the capital, Kabul. Opposition to the Taliban takeover appears to be spreading as defiant Afghans raise the national flag in a growing number of cities. But there have been reports of deaths at some rallies as the Taliban tighten their grip.
The Taliban have only been in Kabul for a few days, but the city has already changed. On Afghanistan's Independence Day, flying the old national flag is no longer just an act of celebration. It's becoming one of defiance. The Taliban have replaced it with their own white banner, but that didn't stop large numbers of people from parading through the streets with the red, black, and green again, sometimes right in front of their new rulers. In some parts of Kabul, gunshots were heard during demonstrations. But so far, the Taliban have showed more restraint than in other parts of the country, where civilians have been beaten and killed for participating in similar protests. Since the city fell to the insurgents, crowds of people have come to Kabul's airport every day in desperate hope of getting out. Coalition leaders have made promises to evacuate those who worked for their military and diplomatic missions, and several thousand have already made it out. But many more are still waiting at the airport. The situation is very bad, and there are twice as many people inside. No one is getting out of here. Even the journey to the airport is uncertain. Taliban fighters are reportedly stopping and checking cars on some of the city's streets, turning back some and allowing others through. Most of the people who make it to the airport can only watch the planes take off, leaving them behind. We were kicked off the plane, the black one that flew away. I was on it. Far from the crowded airport, some people have already come a long way from home to reach temporary camps in Kabul's parks. Now they have nowhere left to run to, and supplies are scarce.
When our country is peaceful, we will return to our homes. At least then we can work and eat in this poverty and helplessness.
Helplessness. It's in the faces and voices of so many Afghans whose government and security forces seem to vanish into thin air. Their world suddenly turned upside down.
Straight to Kabul now, where we join journalist Franz Marty, who's been in the thick of it now for days. Franz, let's start with today's protests and the Taliban reaction. What have you heard?
There have been rallies for the Afghan flag here on Independence Day in Kabul. There have also been reports from a smaller rally in a rural part of Kunar, Eastern Province. It has been different in Kabul in some instances. As you mentioned in the report, Taliban were at the scene and didn't react. In other instances, there has apparently been gunfire from Kunar. There were even casualties reported. Yesterday, similar rallies in Asadabad, Jalalabad, and Khost took also place and led to different reaction. For example, in Khost, the curfew was imposed that seemed to be at least partially caused by this rally. On the other hand, the Taliban commander also said that people are allowed to have the flag. They just have to submit to an Islamic system. In Nangarhar, there have even been pictures that the Taliban celebrated Independence Day, lying down flowers at the grave of the Afghan king that gained independence. And the crowd in this ceremony had also the banners of the flags of the Republic. So different reactions in different places to different times.
Does it look like these protests are gaining momentum?
They have spread a little bit. In general, it should be noticed, though, that They're still relatively small in number, so we're not talking about mass protests that threaten to reverse the Taliban takeover. These protests are relatively small. Nonetheless, they're of significance because they show that the Afghan population does not just tag along with everything that the Taliban want to change, that there's dissent, and now it remains to be seen how this is handled in the weeks to come.
What about Kabul's airport, which has been the focus of so much chaos in recent days? Is the situation there any clearer?
Not really. The situation has been fluid during the past days. Sometimes it seemed like it would become more orderly, just to be followed by more reports of chaos. It's also difficult to pinpoint who's responsible for this, or rather there are indications that all sides are responsible for this. There are reports that the Taliban have said that people should go home and not go to the airport. Taliban have also once or twice made clear in statements that they want Afghans to stay and that they seem it, it looks bad for them if everyone wants to leave. On the other hand, the international forces also seem to be not well set up. There have been examples of people with all their paperwork being ordered to an airport gate just to see it being closed and not being let in. A source from the airport said that no embassy staff is on the ground to process these people. Plus, then you have Afghans, they go to the airport without any papers in the unrealistic hope to somehow get out, and that also makes things difficult.
Franz, as you well know, one region is holding out against the Taliban, and that's the Panjshir Valley northeast of Kabul, where Ahmed Massoud, son of a famed anti-Taliban fighter, appears to be trying to raise a resistance army. What's going on there?
So far, apparently not much. Ahmad Massoud had already before started preparation for resistance. First Vice President Amrullah Saleh is apparently also in the Panjshir Valley, and they try to rally people. To what extent this has been successful can't be said. There have been reports on first skirmishes that remained unverified and were likely inaccurate. The problem is also it's only Panjshir. So in the old days when his father resisted, routes to the borders were open, so they had some supply routes. Now Panjshir is surrounded on all sides by Taliban, and there are reports that the Taliban try to negotiate the surrender of Panjshir before resistance starts. Ahmad Massoud, in today's op-ed in the Washington Post, vowed to fight, but whether this will be possible has to be seen.
Journalist Franz Marty in Kabul. No doubt we'll hear more from you. Thank you so much. For more analysis on the wide-ranging significance and impact of the Taliban in Afghanistan, let's turn now to Mark Turner in Hamburg. Turner's a journalist, author, and Afghanistan expert. Mark, thank you for joining us. Should the West have ever gone into Afghanistan, and if not, why?
I think it's rather an academic question now. The West went in. The question for me is, should the West have gone in this kind of concept? I mean, the concept first was labeled nation building. Then by the mid-2026, 27, it changed. It became COIN, counterinsurgency. And more Afghans took it like a kind of colonial concept. This was the problem.
Is the Taliban's ideology deeply embedded in Afghan society? And if so, how could this shape Afghanistan's political and social landscape?
Deeply, no, I wouldn't think so, because Afghanistan has a very, very important cultural and Islamic tradition. So don't forget that the famous mystic Rumi was an Afghan. It was from the Balkh province. So popular Islam in Afghanistan is quite mystical. So it's not fundamentalist. It's not the Taliban way. Taliban Islam is an import from Pakistan mixed with some Saudi elements. So it's not the popular Afghan Islam.
Got it. There are people in their 20s and 30s in Afghanistan who have grown up in a democracy. How could this new Taliban administration affect this generation?
A democracy, I would put some question marks behind it, because you had warlordism, you had a lot of corruption inside the government, but it's a very big plus. You have free, it's a very big achievement that you had free media. And this element, free media, is very, very popular among young Afghans. So I think this is something that will stay.
A G7 meeting was held in London today, and calls were made for a joint global response to help Afghanistan. Are we looking at further military conflict, you think?
It's possible. It's possible if you think that there are some other very radical groups like Islamic State. So I wouldn't exclude that it could once again become a military conflict, yes.
How much of a threat is the current situation in Afghanistan to the international security?
Yes, I think it's the same point. I'm wondering whether some other radical groups like the Islamic State, for instance, I think it's the most important one, will gain influence, because the Taliban will not be able to control the whole of the Afghan territory. It's very huge. You have mountains, you have deserts. So there are a lot of places where you can hide. And for me, this influence of the Islamic State is one of the most dangerous things to look at the future.
That's Mark Turner in Hamburg. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
The Defense Ministry here says the Bundeswehr has evacuated more than 1,200 people now from Afghanistan. German military aircraft are flying people to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. From Tashkent, evacuees travel on to Germany on commercial flights.
Hugs and huge relief for those arriving at Frankfurt Airport. Even for those with German passports, getting into Kabul Airport and onto a plane to Tashkent was an ordeal. They tell of the chaotic evacuation and of uncertainty about the future of those left behind. The life of an Afghan is cheap at the moment. The way the world is treating us, it's a terrible game they're playing in Afghanistan.
I'm very thankful of German people, from our colleagues at Foreign Office. Thank you very much. You did a lot, and I expected, please continue to help us. I'm worried about my father, my mother, and my brothers and my sister, because now I'm not there, but they are in danger.
Those without German documents are being transferred to this clearing centre in Brandenburg in the east of the country. Around 100 Afghans are expected to arrive here on Thursday evening. As far as I know, they are mostly local staff, possibly also people who have reason to be afraid of the Taliban, such as people from civil society or journalists. And we will take care of them as well.
Die kümmern wir uns natürlich genauso.
They will be given medical assistance and tested for coronavirus before being moved to new homes around the country in the coming days and weeks. The government says it is now doing all it can to bring out above all those who worked closely with Germany and German organisations.
Es ist vollkommen unbestritten.
It is totally without question that the local staff and their family members should come to Germany. We have a moral responsibility for this.
Und dass es dafür auch eine moralische Verantwortung gibt.
These people are not refugees or asylum seekers, but rather they will receive approval to stay from the German government out of national political interests.
Aus gesamtstaatlichen politischen Interessen.
While Germany is a new home for some, others are being welcomed by loved ones. What none of those arriving know is when they might be able to return to Afghanistan.
Let's hear from DW's Asia desk and our Shamil Shams. Shamil, first I wanted to ask you about some of our very own DW correspondents who are still stuck in Afghanistan. We're hearing that a family of a colleague was attacked by the Taliban. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, the situation is very dire for journalists in Afghanistan, across Afghanistan, for all journalists, local, but those who are associated with foreign organizations, their lives are in danger. We have many reporters and correspondents local reporters and correspondents in Afghanistan, and their lives are in danger. Their families' lives are in danger. They have been threatened, harassed, and attacked by the Taliban. And in one case, one of our colleagues who is in Germany, his family has been attacked and a family member has been killed and one is wounded. So the situation is extremely bad. And despite all these claims by the Taliban that they will not do anything against journalists, they will be lenient to journalists and they will respect human rights and will be moderate, it is not happening in Afghanistan at the moment. The situation is very bad.
We should mention that DW has urged the German government to help them. Will they get evacuated?
It's an ongoing process. DW has requested that they be evacuated from Afghanistan as their lives are in danger. It's not just DW, many other organizations have joined hand and they have all called on German authorities to do something about it. And I'm very hopeful that the German government, Berlin, would look into it and they will be evacuated. But it is a difficult situation. It's a difficult process. It's not that easy, but we have our fingers crossed about it.
That's Shamil Sham from DW's Asia desk. Thanks for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
President Biden was keen to wrap up the U.S. mission in Afghanistan by next month's 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. The terrorist strikes that prompted the U.S. invasion also motivated Americans to join the military in the war on terror. But now that the Taliban are back in control in Afghanistan, many are asking what the 20-year mission in the country achieved. DW's Bastian Hartig spoke with one veteran in New York City.
The events of September 11th, 2001 changed the world. And they also changed the life of Dre Popov forever.
I saw a couple that was about, I learned later, a little younger than myself. They had just gotten engaged that week, and I saw them hold hands jumping out of a window. They were 343 firemen that knowingly went into these buildings aware that they're not going to come out. And then you look at yourself and you say, what have I done for anybody besides myself?
So at 22, Dre gave up his job as a children's book illustrator and enlisted as a U.S. Marine. He was first deployed to Iraq and later to Afghanistan. He could notice the difference their presence made there.
We would see that very often in towns. If the radius and the proximity to a U.S. military base meant that women were allowed to walk freely without the escort of a man, you could see their face, children were playing outside. There was a sense of normalcy to some degree. And the further away you got from those military bases, the more they would start veiling and covering themselves. You wouldn't see children playing outside.
But the sense of normalcy came at a great human cost. More than 170,000 people are estimated to have been killed in the Afghanistan war. Some of them at Dre Popov's hands, something he says he's deeply ashamed of.
No one has the right to take anyone's life, ever, for any reason. There's no excuse. All of that immediately you understand the moment that you're a killer. The moment you take somebody's life, you realize how disgusting the very concept of doing that is.
Now, as the Taliban have taken back Afghanistan, the question looms, was it all worth it?
The only thing that's permanent was the death that we caused. But those moments where you could see human progress, I mean, if it's temporary, does it count? Of course not. As the 6-year-old girl who learned how to read and then got her eyes gouged out because she learned how to read because we left. And that's going to happen across the country.
The U.S. may be leaving Afghanistan, but for veterans like Dre Popov, the war isn't over. It continues to be waged in their minds. Every day, 22 U.S. veterans take their own lives because they can't live with the guilt, the memories, the sense of being excluded and abandoned by a society that has moved on. To help veterans like himself, Popov co-founded the non-profit organization Veterans Rebuilding Life. They provide counseling, reintegration services, and even job training, and medical aid to children in the countries they fought in. A way to heal the wounds of war, those of its victims, as well as their own.
I encourage the guys that come in to remember, because it just means that you still have a conscience and that you still want to be a good person. And when you see them actually connecting with these kids, it's impressive. They don't drink anymore, they don't self-destruct, they're not angry, they're not suicidal. They just want to help the next kid. It becomes their new addiction.
And a constant reminder that on both sides of the battlefield, the fallout of America's longest war will be felt for a long time to come.